This is the Best Syndication News video production.
On November 13, 2007, Michael Ehrman gave a presentation to the Pinon Hills Chamber of Commerce. Ehrman, a retired economics professor from California State University of San Bernardino, talked about the subprime lending disaster and the role of the Federal Reserve. He gave a historical perspective and said that economists have learned from past mistakes. Here is that presentation.
We have a gentleman here to speak for us. He has been here before and gave us an excellent, he is a retired professor from San Bernardino State, an economist. And I will turn the floor over to Michael.
Thank you. An economist can't talk without charts. Can't do it. It's impossible. But this is for the second half, all right? And, you know, just the word economics or economist tends to scare a lot of people, doesn't it? It really does. It makes people shake, kind of like mathematics. But it's a lot more fun than that. It really can be a whole lot more fun. And I always say it's because we all live in the economy after all. It's really what's all around us. It's our jobs, and when we go to the malls and get our paychecks, or not get our paychecks, or whatever it might be, right? So I want to talk about two things. I want to talk first about the subprime mortgage crisis that we had this past summer that peaked. We're still seeing the residual effects of it, and we will for some time. But I want to talk a little bit about the actual crisis in the summer, and then I want to talk a little. I want to come back and fit that into the bigger economy, and then how we right here fit into that. All right, and try to tie it all together. And if I keep sort of grabbing here, I thought there would be an edge.
Yeah,
but that's okay. It just means that I can't walk around, and I tend to like to be able to walk around, but it'll all fall on the floor. But that's okay, don't worry. No, I have to pull them apart. This is fine. And what I want to say about the subprime mortgage crisis that we had this summer is that it's really an example of how psychology drives so much of the economy. How psychology, our mental state, pushes and makes economic events happen. You know, back in the late 1999, 2000, when the stock market was just going up and up and up, remember that? Remember Alan Greenspan, the Federal Reserve Chairman, talked about the irrational exuberance? Remember that? The irrational exuberance that he couldn't explain? Here was people just buying stock and buying stock because everybody else was. They weren't quite sure if it was good stock or bad stock or what would happen, but everybody else was doing it, so it was kind of like a stampede, wasn't it? Everybody had to get on it. Well, unfortunately, that very same psychology can turn around and become fear. The flip side of that euphoria can be fear. And I think we saw an example of it with the subprime mortgage crisis. Because the reality was that only a very small percent of all those mortgages were in fact subprime. Only a very small example, a very small number of them. But we didn't know how many of them there might be, and we didn't know how many of them might ultimately go into default. We didn't know that. And that unknown is what makes people afraid, not knowing. Now, to really talk about it and to make more sense out of the subprime mortgage crisis and sort of the spillover effects, you need to know a little bit about, unfortunately, history. I'm an economic historian, and I can't help but look at the roots of any kind of an event. And if you go back to the 1930s, in 1929, 1930, we didn't have 30-year mortgages. Did you know that? We didn't have long-term mortgages. If you wanted to buy a house, you might get a loan for 7 or 8 years. but more likely you use cash. You use cash or very short-term mortgages. As a result, it was only the upper middle class and the wealthy who could really afford homes. Most people were tenants. Most people were renters. Well, during the Depression, to try to move the economy, to get activity going in the economy, President Roosevelt, had an idea. Let's create a 30-year loan. Let's create a 30-year loan. Now, how do you convince a bank, really a savings and loan back then, to lend somebody money for 30 years? They don't want to hold a mortgage for 30 years. They want that money back so they can loan it out again. So what the government did, is they said to banks, you go ahead and loan the money for 30 years. Make a 30-year loan, and we'll buy that loan from you. You won't be stuck with it. We'll buy it from you. We'll give you almost all the money. A little bit of a discount. Then we'll take all of the mortgages that we buy from all you bankers, and we'll package them up together. We'll bundle them together as a bond, as a government bond, backed by the Federal Housing Authority, the FHA. And with that money that they got from selling the bond, they took that money and gave it to the bankers and the mortgage bankers and the savings and loans. So they didn't have to hold the long-term mortgages. It was the FHA that then sold the bonds, and so it was the bondholders, wealthy people who wanted good, sound investments. There's always people who want to invest in long-term, secure interest rates that are well secured. And these mortgage-backed loans, and of course backed by the government, made them all the more secure. Now, until the 1980s, this process of gathering up loans and selling them and raising the money to pay back the banks as bonds was all done by the government. But in the 1980s, we saw Republican administrations that wanted to and believed in, a more private economy, a more free enterprise economy. And they deregulated a lot of the banking structure and a lot of the banking industry. And they allowed then private banks, private investment banks on Wall Street to do the same thing, to package up loans and resell them and pass the proceeds on back to the bankers. Well, by the 1990s, what we see is Wall Street bankers trying to find all kinds of new devices to get wealthy investors to invest their money in their device. We saw hedge funds, we saw derivatives, we see all kinds of things, the names of which you wouldn't even understand, and I barely understand. But they created all kinds of investment structures to get wealthy people to invest because they got the fee for selling it, didn't they? And they usually got the fee for managing it. So they came up with all of these new ideas. And one of them that they hit on big time was this idea of packaging up mortgages and selling the bonds. Because that, of course, then would come back as the fees to the company, to the investment bank. And so we see a large demand beginning to grow. The demand for mortgages really begins to expand by the late 1990s, early 2000. And as these investment bankers now want more and more mortgages, we're starting to see looser and looser requirements for qualifying for a mortgage. Now, of course, what made that possible was
This has been a Best Syndication News video production.